These series of videos look at the American Revolution after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, after the fighting began. There's 6 short videos that comprise this, and this first one looks at the role that loyalists and rebels played, people that supported the crown and people that supported the colonists, and where African Americans stood in that spectrum. It's critical to understand that not all Americans supported revolution, and often there was violence between Americans. The number of people that were loyalists or supported the crown estimates range from about a quarter to a fifth of the total American population. Colonists referred to American loyalists as Tories. Tories was the term used to designate supporters of the king in British politics. And they referred to themselves, of course, as Patriots. The British simply referred to the colonials as rebels. Regardless, if you were a Tory, a loyalist to the king, you would often face harassment, things like being tarred and feathered and ridiculed. In June 1775, the First Continental Congress passed a resolution declaring Loyalists to be traitors, and then colony after colony began to pass similar resolutions against the Loyalists in their colony. Most made it clear that helping the British was treasonous, or they thought that helping the British was treasonous, but otherwise they were unclear on who or what treason actually was. What about, for example, the Quakers who tried to be neutral? What about the wives of known loyalists and so forth? A wide group of people tended to favor continual British rule. People like government officials and appointees whose jobs depended upon royal sanction. Wealthy merchants who dealt with lucrative contracts with the British. Conservative lawyers who were trained in British law and they feared anarchy like the French Revolution. You had large plantation owners who sold staple crops to the British, and of course ordinary farmers who maybe had distinct religious or cultural identities which tied them to Great Britain. Not surprisingly, for example, the Irish supported rebellion, but the Highland Scots did not. New Lights and the Great Awakening tended to support rebellion, while Old Lights didn't. Whenever one ethnic group aligned, often its enemies would often simply take the other side. In general, there are probably more loyalists in the South than in the North. That really shouldn't be too surprising because the South fit better into the British mercantilistic system. There have been a number of historians who say the American Revolution really was between Americans as much as the British. They would say the Revolution was as much who would rule at home as home rule. They point, for example, between tensions internal within colonies, often between the eastern areas and the western areas of the colonies. The eastern areas were settled and more prosperous. There were less Indian problems, while the western frontiersmen were poor and faced constant Indian attack. The West, therefore, kept petitioning the colonial governments to raise militias to protect them, but the colonial assemblies were dominated by the rich Easterners who didn't want to tax themselves, and so that would often anger the western frontiersmen. You can find a number of actual fighting and uprisings by the Westerners against the Easterners, shown here as one of the earlier ones in Virginia, Bacon's Rebellion in the 1600s. Most of these rebellions fizzled out or failed. When the First Continental Congress began to define treason, Tories began to organize. In New Hampshire, the governor tried to raise a loyalist force in his state to battle the Sons of Liberty, but he could muster only 59 people. Most Tories, however, felt so harassed that they fled or simply kept quiet. It's estimated that up to 100,000 loyalists escaped, some to England, but many of them went to loyalist Canada. Whenever they fled, the colonists would confiscate their property, and if they didn't confiscate it, it was often looted. After the war, when tempers had cooled somewhat, many of the loyalists were allowed to return. You might even think of For example, Benedict Arnold, the famous trader's father-in-law, was a Tory who skipped town, and when he came back, he actually was advanced to the point of becoming a Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice. A huge potential group of Tories was, of course, black slaves and free blacks who weren't treated fairly by the colonies. And the British, not surprisingly, recognized this. And not only the British, many educated colonials are aware of the hypocrisy. Here they are touting their Enlightenment ideas and freedom and equality, and America should be independent, and yet they accepted slavery. The best example of this was, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote about it and eventually agreed to free his slaves at his death. When you speak of Jefferson, you're probably familiar with Sally Hemings, who was one of his slaves, and most scholars believe that Jefferson fathered at least one, perhaps more, children by Sally Hemings. Interestingly, Sally Hemings was Jefferson's wife, who had recently died, half-sister. Jefferson's wife's father had sex with slaves and fathered children by different mothers in that way. So it's a convoluted thing. But Jefferson realized the hypocrisy of Enlightenment ideas and the continuation of slavery. The colonists, of course, needed all the help they could get, and they wrestled with the issue of arming free blacks early in the war. Some even said they ought to arm slaves earlier in the war, but they were a minority. They could obviously, as I say, use all the help, but arming free blacks or even slaves could turn against them. I mean, the slaves might just take their guns and attack them. I should note that African Americans had fought successfully with the British and the colonials against the French in the earlier French-Indian War, so there was precedent. Anyway, fearful of an insurrection, the colonists initially decided against using black slaves. Even Massachusetts rejected the idea because while the majority of colonists there hated slavery, they wanted it to be illegal. Letting slaves into the colonial army would be in a way to recognize the legitimacy of slavery itself. After George Washington took over the colonial army, he pushed the idea that blacks were not needed. He issued an order banning the recruitment of black slaves. His ban, however, didn't affect blacks already in the service, but within a few months a movement grew to get the blacks that were already in out anyway. Soon after the Battle of Lexington and Concord at the beginning of the war, as the colonists wrestled with what to do regarding African Americans, the Virginia royal governor, obviously appointed by the king and loyal to the king, issued a proclamation, quote, "I do hereby declare all indentured servants, Negroes, or others free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper dignity," unquote. Obviously, he hoped to disrupt the colonial army and the colonial economy. This proclamation, I should note, doesn't show, however, that the British cared about the slaves. The governor would free only those slaves able to bear arms and not women or children. And in fact, the governor himself even kept slaves for himself throughout the war. Fearful of a massive rebellion in reaction to the governor's proclamation, Washington began to retreat on his ban, and he first did so by allowing free blacks. The Second Continental Congress then followed, despite strong resistance from the southern colonies. Some in the southern colonies, themselves fearful, began to promise better treatment of their slaves if the slaves remained loyal. Virginia promised to pardon without punishment all slaves that had already left to join the British. As the war went on, thousands of blacks indeed fled to the British lines. Thomas Jefferson estimated in 1778 alone that 30,000 Virginia slaves had run away. In South Carolina, the estimates were as high as 25,000. Historians have estimated that Georgia lost 75% of its 15,000 slaves. The British didn't really use the runaway black slaves all that much, and a lot of that was because they had their own racism. And when they did use them, they often had them digging latrines or cooking and so forth, working with the laundry. Nevertheless, the British did form at least a couple of black regiments to do fighting, and notably it was a black colonial regiment that played a key role in a British siege on the colonists at Savannah, Georgia. As the war dragged on, obviously the colonists were running out of men, feeling increasingly desperate, and they even began towards the end of the war to end their ban on the slaves themselves. As a matter of fact, some colonists even appeared to be competing to enlist the slaves by the end of the war. New Hampshire even offered to pay them, the slave enlistees, the same as whites. Other colonies would give bounties to slave owners if they would allow their slaves to enlist. Implicit, or at least assumed by the blacks, was that they would win their freedom for remaining loyal and fighting for the colonies. But of course, the white colonists purposely remained quiet on that. In the end, of the approximately 300,000 American soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War, roughly 5,000 were African Americans. Blacks were with Washington when he famously crossed the Delaware River. And most were in the Navy, but there were some that were gunners in the Army. This concludes the first of the 6 lectures on the American Revolution, this one on who the Tories and Loyalists and the rebels and the Patriots were, and of course where African Americans stood in that spectrum.